Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV. I'm Fraser Nelson. On this week's show, we ask if a housing ladder has become a trap. We look at the growing political rebellion against Boris Johnson's reforms. We also look at the notion of white privilege and whether that can be reconciled with the performance of the white working class in the education system. We look at the Manchester bombing inquiry. Douglas Murray asks what that's thrown up. And finally, we look at Hogarth, his legacy, and the great political satirists. We speak to Michael Heath, the Spectator's cartoon editor, about his life and his art. First, our cover story this week is about the scandal of new build houses. Boris Johnson wants his MPs to vote through planning reforms, but the rebellion is stretching far beyond Westminster. Owning a home used to be a dream, but for millions, it's now a nightmare due to the dismal quality of homes and the crippling cost of repairing them. I'm joined now by James Forsyth and Katy. So James, tell us about this parliamentary housing rebellion.
I think Tory MPs think that these measures will not be popular in their constituencies. That sense has been massively heightened by the Chesham and Amersham by-election, where the Lib Dems campaigned very heavily in opposition to the government's proposed planning reforms. And when you see a seat with a 16,000 Tory majority end up with an 8,000 Lib Dem majority, that's more votes than the Lib Dems got in total in that seat in 2017. You see lots of Tory MPs begin to get nervous, and it's worth remembering that this policy wasn't popular on the Tory benches in the first place. You know, if you think back to last year, there was a housing algorithm that was meant to work out essentially to say, right, the most houses should be built where houses are least affordable. That meant lots of houses being built in the southeast. You know, a Tory rebellion forced huge tweaks to that algorithm. And we haven't yet seen the bill. And I think the one thing the whips are trying to say to MPs is, look, you know, one of the things that the Dems went very hard on in the by-election was the idea that under this proposals, there would be some individual developments that residents wouldn't be able to object to. I think there will be some movement on that before we see the bill. But I think the Tory party is caught in a real bind here because with its existing southern electoral base, the idea of more houses in their constituencies is not particularly popular. But if they don't build more houses, they risk seeing what's happened to them in London, where the shift against home ownership has cost the Tories dearly, happening in other places in the southeast.
Now, Katy, Boris Johnson's got a pretty big majority of 78. Could he really have lost control of Parliament already? Could we really be in a situation where he cannot get his signature planning reforms through Parliament because his party is prepared to overturn that size of a majority?
I think when it comes to reform and driving change, Boris Johnson so far is actually not in a great situation because we have had quite a few rebellions, and I think on planning reform, many MPs in the South think that ultimately the reforms are dead. Now, cabinet ministers disagree. There are some who are arguing privately, actually what the government needs to do is double down on this. You know, these southern MPs don't know what's good for them. If you don't build more homes, if you don't do something drastic, you're not going to have Tory voters in about 10, 15 years' time. But I think anyone who can do basic arithmetic is starting to see the problem in this. And I think the issue for Boris Johnson is that once, an MP rebels, they often do it again. And you can start to see it on a range of issues. So we just had the foreign aid rebellion that didn't get to be a rebellion in terms of the floor of the Commons, because there was not a vote in the end, but the government looked on course to lose it. And I think that one of the issues for Boris Johnson when it comes to trying to talk around these people, should they press ahead with drastic planning reforms, is that, people are very worried about losing their seats in the next election. And that, as James says, that's from the by-election. But B, there are lots of MPs in traditional Tory seats who don't have much time for Boris Johnson. They don't think Boris Johnson has treated them with respect. And they think that Boris Johnson, when Theresa May was Prime Minister, didn't really listen to the whip. So why should they?
Now, James, we know what Boris Johnson personally thinks about this. He thinks, as you were saying, that more house owners means more Tory voters, and that these southern Tory NIMBYs are basically writing their own political funeral wishes because nobody's going to vote for them if people can't get houses. So can we see here almost a sort of I wouldn't call it ideology, but certain political principles here. The kind of what Shirley Letwin argued are the vigorous virtues of home ownership. As soon as you let somebody buy a house, that person becomes a Tory voter. Is that how you think the argument is seen in number 10?
Yeah, look, the Tory party is the party of the property-owning democracy. And if in these seats you get fewer homeowners and more renters, they will become less safe. The problem you've got is the transition period, essentially, which is the initially approving the building of more houses is not necessarily popular in these places. Lots of these people moved out because they wanted to live somewhere which they felt was quite rural. And if you end up with lots more houses being built, people will feel that sense is being taken away from them. You know, and an Englishman's home is his castle and all that. And so I think you run into those problems. I think that other issue for number 10 now is planning is so up in lights that there is a danger you end up in the worst of all worlds, which is you have to make concessions to get the bill through, so the bill doesn't do that much. But then every extra house or every unpopular development is blamed on these reforms, even if it could have passed beforehand. But I do think this housing problem is something that you need to find a way to solve, because you clearly need more houses where people want to live.
Now I'd like to bring in my colleague Emma Byrne. She's assistant editor of The Spectator, recently a homeowner. Emma, you bought a new build, and as James says, an English woman's home is her castle. Has that been your experience?
Very much not so. I am a victim of the cladding scandal. I bought my one-bed flat in East London under a government-backed shared ownership scheme in 2016. Last year, I found out that due to retrospective changes and also after tests, very shoddy building work, that my home will need major works to bring it up to scratch. And that because the way that leasehold law works, essentially, I will be footing the bill, which could run into tens and tens of thousands of pounds, money which I don't have.
Right, so we're talking here a bill of what could be, I don't know, 40 or 50 grand, that kind of size?
Yeah, the government has been collecting very few data and the bills are only starting to land. But the Sunday Times had a piece out on Sunday which showed that the average bill in a high rise, which I'm in, which is over 18 metres, is roughly 40 to 50,000, with the average, that's per flat, what the remediation will cost.
Right.
It's about 5 million a building.
And how many people are affected by this? Are you a freak case?
No, not at all. So the EWS1, which is the buildings need to be checked to get this special form, it could be up to 3 million people. 3
million people could be stung basically for bills, huge bills. I mean, you say the average is 50 grand in a high rise. What, simply because Robert Jenrick decided to change regulations and saddle people like you with a bill? But why couldn't you go back to the people you bought the house from and say, look, you sold me a building that was not fit for purpose. It's time for you to foot the bill, not me.
Well, the 3 million people is EWS1. The affected leaseholders is around 750,000 to 1.5 million, I think it is, who could face extraordinary bills. Essentially, the way that leasehold law works, freeholders can just pass these costs on with very little legal protection. Also, I'm in a new build, so I have vague legal protections under the Defective Premises Act, and also I've still got my warranty in place. But again, there's absolutely no guarantee because of these retrospective changes that I can bring a claim against any of this. And for people who are in buildings that are older, it's essentially up to the whim of the freeholder and developer, who are increasingly proving themselves quite bad players.
Right, so you can see the political problem here. I mean, according to classic political theory, you should be an aspiring Tory voter, given that you're a homeowner. But would you describe yourself as an aspiring Tory voter now?
I mean, absolutely not. This has revolutionised me and certainly a generation of homeowners against this government who seem to be either not understanding the scale of what's coming, which is going to be mass repossessions, quite frankly, because no one can pay these bills, especially as a lot of people are first-time buyers, or more cynically, that we're collateral damage to protect the industry.
I'd like to bring in another colleague now, Kate Andrews. Kate, you're renting, you'd like to buy a house. What do you think about this?
Well, I've been lucky enough to share a COVID bubble with Emma in the office this year, and it's been horrible to watch what she's gone through, but frankly I've learned a lot from her, and I wouldn't touch a new build now. I think there have been failures across the board here. The builders have taken advantage of the situation. The government's very restrictive planning system has made it very difficult for little guys to get in and to build more homes. So I think there are multiple problems going on here, but I am looking to buy for the first time. I'm very hopeful I'll be able to do so in the near future. I had one of the mainstream estate agents call me the other day, and they said, "Oh, we have this property, we'd like for you to look at it." And I said, "Oh, it looks like it's a new build." And they said, "Yeah, you get more space, it's brand new." And I said, "Oh no, sorry, I'm not interested," keeping Emma's story in the back of my mind. They really pushed me. They said, "Oh, if you're worried about cladding, don't worry about that. This building is completely up to scratch, it's brand new." And I pushed back. I said, now that the government is willing to retrospectively change the law on these building materials, on cladding, it's just not an investment I think I want to make. And the guy paused on the phone. He laughed and he said, "Wow, you really know your stuff. Yeah, I wouldn't touch them either."
My goodness. So the estate agent and somebody in the business of selling houses basically knew that they had dodgy products on their books, and that even he thought that the risk of being stung with a bill wasn't worth it.
This is a stitch up on every level. Houses are being built and sold to people, and there is widespread awareness that they're just not up to scratch. So I'm very thankful for Emma for sharing her story with so many of us, and she's been doing really great work highlighting the issue of the cladding scandal here at The Spectator, but also on lots of other platforms, because first and foremost, this issue needs to be raised for people like Emma who are so badly affected by it and who are getting these huge bills through the mail. But it's important for people like me too, those of us who are hopeful first-time buyers who could be walking into a huge trap. And as I said before, this is happening at every level, from the builders to the government, even to the estate agents. Everybody knows there's a problem, but it's a very expensive one to fix, and nobody wants to foot the bill. So poor Emma's told that she's going to have to pay for it.
James Forsyth, can I bring you back in here? You've written quite a lot about how Tory MPs need to accept the need to build more houses. If they don't do it, they'll be consigning themselves to political history. But do you think the Prime Minister is taking in the stories of people like of Kate and Emma here, that sort of houses that realistically are on the horizon are houses that a lot of young people don't want to touch because they basically think that they cannot afford the sword of Damocles hanging over them, the massive bills they might get if they buy shoddy houses. And rightly or wrongly, word is getting out that if you buy a new build, you're going to be in for some pretty unpleasant surprises in a few years' time.
I think one of the points that Liam Halligan makes so powerfully in his cover story for this week's Spectator is that the housing industry in this country is essentially an oligopoly. It's dominated by 5 or 6 big developers, and that is an unhealthy market. I think one of the arguments in favour of planning reform is that by simplifying the process, it would make it easier for small builders to do developments, because there would be less legal work involved in the planning process. I personally think that you need to go further than that. I think you need the government to directly commission small builders to inject more competition into the housing market.
James, Katy and Emma, thanks very much indeed. Now, Kate Andrews also has a very good story in the magazine this week about the extent of the kind of privileges being enjoyed not just by the UEFA officials who are flying into London quarantine-free to watch the football final, but the way in which several government members have been availing themselves of loopholes not open to the rest of us over the last few weeks and months. So, Kate, tell us what you've uncovered.
Well, if you look at the lifestyles of some people in the highest levels of government, and as we're seeing this week with the football, other members of the so-called elite, and the rest of us who have had to obey these COVID rules, you're seeing a real stark contrast in behavior. Now, this isn't about rule breaking, it's not about breaking the law, it's the fact that ministers designed these COVID rules, and so they know exactly where they can bend them and where the loopholes are. In the first lockdown, there were a lot of political casualties. You saw resignations, you saw quite a famous Rose Garden press conference to defend behavior from people who were thought to be bending the rules as they saw fit. But this time round, in the second and third lockdown, there was more leeway. But of course the public isn't made aware of that leeway. So you have some pretty egregious examples of, say, Michael Gove flying back from the Champions League final in Portugal, getting pinged by Test and Trace, and not quarantining. And he's not quarantining because there's a scheme which you can go on which allows you to test daily.
Wait, there's a scheme that gets you out of quarantine if you're pinged. I'm not sure many people know about this scheme. How do you apply?
Yeah, I suspect a lot of our viewers won't be familiar with it, and that's because it's not very clear how you sign up to this scheme. I've been on the government's webpage, and there's no click here and apply button. There's an email address at the very bottom to get a bit more information, but it's not even clear that that would sign you up to the scheme. But it does exist. Michael Gove certainly knows about it. You know, he's been at the center of all these discussions and all of these systems, so he's on the scheme. But there are plenty of people out there, you know, your normal worker who's reliant on an hourly wage who would love to be on that scheme, and yet has been sitting at home for 8, 9, 10 days, depending on when they get pinged, doing what they think they're supposed to do, abiding by the rules.
Well, okay, so Kate, can you just say how many other people are on this scheme? We know Michael Gove's on it, but is it, I don't know, are there hundreds, are there thousands? How many people right now are living in a system where you are not at risk from being pinged? I mean, I know a colleague of mine, ours at Lara, she's having a christening on Saturday. She's terrified about being pinged in case the christening is called off. Katy Balls, she's getting married in a couple of weeks. She's terrified about being pinged before her wedding. She'd have to cancel that. So how many people are not living under the sort of the threat of being interned by NHS Test and Trace?
Well, we're told that thousands of people will be offered the scheme, but again, it is not at all clear how one gets that offer or why Michael Gove, who is a minister in cabinet, got offered that scheme as opposed to why somebody else would. It raises questions, and I think those questions grow louder when you look at the behavior of other ministers as well, especially around travel. So it has been an extraordinary fact of the third lockdown that for months at a time, it was actually illegal to leave the country. Your passport would not get you out of the country. You had to fit very specific and strict requirement to be able to legally leave. But there were exemptions for ministers, not just travel exemptions, but quarantine and testing exemptions as well. Now, you can think of lots of good reasons why government officials might need to travel abroad, even in a pandemic. National security reasons. Potentially, I think there's an argument for Liz Truss, the trade secretary. You know, we've just left the European Union. She's trying to secure trade deals. I think you can just about argue it. But why was Wendy Morton, one of the foreign ministers, in Greece in March, when people couldn't even sit on a park bench together, touring Greece, touring the ancient architecture to talk about climate change? Why was Greg Hands throughout the winter going to Slovenia and Croatia, tweeting about how he was delighted to be back where he took his honeymoon so that he could be talking about business and tech? I think it becomes really difficult to argue that those are necessary, essential trips when people can't legally leave the country. It would be one thing, perhaps, if we had actually opened up on the 21st of June. I think there would be less scrutiny over this if they had returned our freedoms. But we're now seeing photos of Michael Gove, Matt Hancock, the health secretary, Nadhim Zawahi, the vaccine minister, at the football, multiple of them in VIP sections, enjoying themselves, kicking back, relaxing. Well, we're still told that 7 people cannot legally gather together in your private home. You know, these ministers have put in a lot of hard work. The vaccine rollout's been a huge success. I don't blame them for wanting to take a break. But it's the inconsistency and the different parallel lifestyles that's problematic. It's fine for them to go to the football, but is it not fine for us to watch it in our homes together and have a beer and enjoy each other's company?
But Kate, here is one answer. It's always been the case that senior politicians have been able to be blue-lighted across the traffic if they need to be, given various tips and perks to speed up their life because they are acting on behalf of the people. That's the argument, not just in the old Soviet Union, but here in democracies, that if you're at the top of governments, your time needs to be precious. You need a greater license to operate because a lot of people are counting on you being able to do your job well. So surely what we're seeing with the loopholes you're talking about is just simply a more vivid extension of what happens in any healthy democracy, is that steps are taken to let politicians and ministers go about their job as quickly as possible for the sake of us all.
we're well aware that if you're in a position of power, you're always going to be able to bend the rules just that little bit more, right? I think that's widely acknowledged. But these are very different circumstances. Our liberties have been taken away. We have been told to stay home. We have been legally required to stay in the country. You are breaking the law if you have more than 5 friends, 6 friends, whatever your household size is, into your home. You know, you could be slapped with a fine worth thousands and thousands of pounds. And if Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, needs to go abroad for some reason for national security purposes, that's quite an easy argument to make. But the idea that our day-to-day lives are any less essential or less important than a minister who's in Croatia talking about business and tech, or Alex Sharma, who's president of COP26, in March going to France, going to Kenya, going to Costa Rica, to talk about a conference that's taking place in Glasgow, and not opting for Zoom, and instead opting to fly around the world during a pandemic, which we're told is far too dangerous for us to do, isn't a matter of working in the public's interest. It's just simply not fair.
Kate Andrews, thanks very much indeed. Now, if you subscribe to The Spectator, you'll have read about these stories, but if you don't, then maybe you'd like to give us a try. We're offering 4 weeks free on spectator.co.uk/TV offer. I'd argue that life is too short to not read The Spectator, but then again, I'm biased. Now, have white working class kids been left behind in our education system? A report from a select committee in Parliament this week says that poor white boys perform worse than almost every other group at every level of education. Robert Halfon, who chairs the committee, joins me now, along with Maurice Mcleod, who's the chief exec of Race on the Agenda, an anti-racism campaign group. Now, Robert Halfon, let's start with you. You took a question from Nick Gibb during your inquiry, and he told you straight out that race isn't a factor. It's poverty that holds people back. So have you guys been barking up the wrong tree all along?
Well, I have massive respect for Nick Gibb. I approve what he's done to try and improve standards. I think that his work on phonics and literacy is incredibly important, but I have a fundamental disagree with him, and I think his answer was part of the muddled thinking that has gone on for decades in response to this problem. We know that there are 900,000 plus white working class pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds on free school meals. We know that at every stage of the education system, they underperform almost every other ethnic group. You know, just 17.7% get passes at GCSE maths and English, and just 16% go to university, and that's lower than Afro-Caribbean and other ethnic groups. So the stock answer to this has always been, it's muddled and it's in some ways lazy thinking, is that it is due to poverty, and what is needed is more of the same policies from the department. If it was down to poverty, of course that's a factor. Why on earth are other ethnic communities, for the most part, performing much better than disadvantaged white working class pupils? And often the poverty levels of those ethnic communities are even worse than disadvantaged white communities.
Right. Maurice Mcleod, you're chief exec of Race on the Agenda. Do you think it's right that race should be at the forefront of this particular agenda when we're trying to work out why some kids do worse than others, and we should look at white working class as a discrete group?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. When I saw that this report was coming out, there have been a number, it feels, of reports into white working class kids and their underachievement. To my mind, the issue with, and it's right to highlight that this group, the group that are on free school meals, which isn't the same as saying working class, by the way. 60% of people consider themselves working class, but I think that's sort of like 15 or 17% of kids are actually on free school meals. So it doesn't map quite as clearly as maybe the headlines are pretending. But to my mind, they're not disadvantaged because of their race. That's why I find the framing maybe of this work slightly confusing.
Right. And Robert Halfon, that's quite a good point, isn't it? I mean, you looked at the phrase white privilege in your report, and you said you didn't think it was a helpful term. But if you use language like this, that was quite explosive. Several members of your committee walked out. But you also say that even the terminology isn't quite there. As Maurice Mcleod says, we're not really talking about white working class. In your report, you look at kids on free school meals. Now, sure, that's a subsection of the working class, but there isn't even language here for what you're grasping, not just for answers, but you're grasping for basic vocabulary.
Yeah, the first point is we make it very clear in the report, the data set we're looking at, and we're looking at white working class boys and girls on free school meals from disadvantaged backgrounds, and we explain that in the report. Of course, there is a generic term for white working class, but that is the group that we are looking at that underperform, as I say, against almost every other ethnic group. Now, on the point of white privilege, and the reason why we put this in the report, the Labour members didn't walk out, they just voted against the report. But the reason why we put it in, because it's wrong, fundamentally wrong for three reasons. So the first reason is that if you use the concept of white privilege, you are implying collective guilt when it should be individual responsibility for acts of racism. And the second reason is if you use the word white privilege, you're basically telling a poorer white community that they are privileged. You're telling a single parent who might live in a tiny flat in my constituency of Harlow, who are doing their best to bring up their child, that they have white privilege. And the third reason is that it's factually incorrect, because all the data shows that far from being privileged in education, these disadvantaged white communities are doing worse, as I repeat, than almost any other ethnic group. And I just want to add that I am not, this is, people go on about the culture wars. If you walk along the streets of my constituency, no one would even know what the culture wars are about. I am raising this, my committee has raised this, because all that people hear, and you can make an intellectual argument about what white privilege means, but I'm a Ron Seal type politician. White privilege does what it says on the tin. It just tells people, whatever their background, whatever their circumstances, that they have white privilege. Those are the only two words that they hear, and it's wrong. It's being introduced by councils, it's being recommended by educational groups. It's got to stop spreading. It is not the way to deal with racism.
Maurice Mcleod, you must have some sympathy with that. I mean, is white privilege problematic? Does the very phrase tell somebody in a council estate who's had no privilege at all in their life, but they're inherently well off just because of the colour of their skin? It's a form of racism, isn't it?
Yeah, so I think the white privilege thing, to me, it's a bit of a red herring. I think that's getting obsessed on whether that term translates well with a certain audience isn't really the thing. I don't think so. So yes, arguing to someone that's really deprived, that's seen all economic sort of benefit go a different direction, and telling that person they've got privilege seems like a hard thing to say. But you wouldn't find any difficulty telling someone who's poor and was really struggling, yes, you're really poor, but aren't you better off than someone who's disabled, for instance? That they can understand that link. And I think that sometimes when we have these sorts of conversations, so if you're talking about, for instance, kids on free school meals, which is what we're talking about, white kids on free school meals, and you compare them to black kids on free school meals and say, look, they're achieving even worse. Isn't that terrible? This shows that it's because they're white and they're being disadvantaged. Surely the geography of where people are, as I think it says in the report, place matters. Now, if you're comparing, kids in the north in a deprived area with black kids in London who, yes, have equal levels of poverty or sometimes even more poverty, but have other resources around them because they happen to live in the south where all of the wealth has been extracted to, you're not comparing like with like.
So Robert, your problem then is that you've got the debate, but you want to talk about the white working class. Even that phrase is problematic. You talk about white privilege. It's so incendiary that you've got members of your committee who don't vote with the report. And then if you read the report, I have to say I couldn't find very much in the way of solutions from it. At the end, I mean, I think it seems that there's a quote from the New Schools Network of the Centre for Social Justice saying that there was no national solution to this problem. So aren't you really on a hiding to nothing here? You are sort of going into this sort of culture wars-y territory, but to no real avail.
Well, I think with massive respect to you, Fraser, that's wrong on all counts, because the report is full of full of solutions to deal with this problem. I mean, the issue is that, first of all, in terms of even discussing the underperformance of white working class boys and girls, it's seen as a taboo issue, and it isn't that loads of people are discussing. Whenever it's raised, you get a huge amounts of criticism. We should be able to debate things like the terminology of white privilege without being shouted down, or without being described, as I have been by the NEU, as Dr. Shipman today, or representatives from the NEU. We have to debate and discuss these things. Otherwise, you just close down debate, and one side has all the arguments.
Robert, but to some extent, are you not tilting at windmills a little bit here? I mean, how often, as you say, go into the streets, people don't use language like culture wars. How often do they come across the language?
The problem is that it's being the concept of white privilege is being recommended and introduced in our education system, recommended by educational groups, recommended by councils, and we've got examples of that in the report. But in terms of the solutions, again, that is wrong. The report is full of solutions, changing the. What's happened often is that money has been thrown at big cities. So we had the London Challenge, which has improved London schools, but towns have been left behind. We recommend to target much better the pupil premium, so that you target funding down to at neighbourhood level where disadvantaged communities live. We recommend that family hubs should be put around in every town across the country, because early years intervention makes a difference. We've looked at what the Feltham Reach Academy do and suggest parental engagement programs where parents have been disengaged from the curriculum and education from one generation to the next, and it does work because we've seen examples of it from Feltham Reach. We've suggested solutions in terms of increasing the vocational elements of the curriculum, perhaps having design and technology in the baccalaureate, getting teachers to disadvantaged areas by introducing teaching degree apprenticeships and bursaries and financial incentives, and training colleges or training providers for those teachers in disadvantaged areas. We've suggested adult community learning centres in every town, again to re-engage parents. We've looked at the University Access Fund, 800 million that's spent to try and get disadvantaged pupils, which is not working, to university. It's not working at all, and suggested that there should be proper targets from the Office of Students to get more white disadvantaged students into university, but also using it to fund more degree apprenticeships, so these pupils can earn while they learn, not worry about taking on debt, get a skill and get a job at the end. So all the way through the report, it is lined with explanation and lined with solutions, and the white privilege argument is literally 2 or 3 pages out of a 90-page report. So the report is full of solutions. You may not agree with them, that is your right, but it is wrong to say that this is just a report, or imply that it's just a report about the cultural, whatever you want to call it, the cultural battle, cultural wars.
Maurice, one of the things that does come through from the report is the limitations. Even when you're talking about BAME, for example, that's a generalisation. But even black is a generalisation, because the outcomes for black Africans seem to be significantly worse than for black Caribbeans in major parts of the education system. The same is true if you talk about South Asians. The outcomes for Indians tend to be a lot better than whites. For Pakistani and Bangladeshi backgrounds, a lot worse. So isn't there a lot more nuance here than either label BAME or even South Asian and black? Are these labels starting to conceal more than they reveal?
I'm not sure that they're concealing more than they reveal. I do think there's a problem with labels. It's one of the things that the Cred report pointed to, which I think was kind of a right to point out that the BAME sort of label lumps everyone in together, and there are so many different experiences that different groups have. So I think it's worth pointing out. I do think that I don't think that should be used to say, okay, so it's all too complicated, let's just not look at it at all, or we do need to drill down into individual communities. We do need to drill down and look at the Gypsy Roma traveller communities and work out why they are often achieving so much lower than almost any other group. These things do matter, and they are connected to culture and to race and things like that.
But what about white working class, though? I mean, do you accept there's a problem there? Because if you look at them, you'll have seen these league tables. White working class are the group least likely to get into university in this country, more than any other ethnic group. There are studies after studies which show white boys, specifically white working class boys, as being the bottom of this pile. So if you care about inequality, I mean, I've known you for 20 years, and you've always been going on. You've always been on the side of those facing the strongest headwinds. Isn't there a case to say, for whatever reason, white working class boys are facing incredibly strong headwinds in this country? They may be in the ethnic majority, but they're really facing problems. And if we care about those problems, we simply have to have these conversations, no matter how uncomfortable they might be.
Absolutely. No, we absolutely have to have the conversation. But what I'm, I guess, challenging is that I don't think that this part of the conversation needs to be racialised. If you're talking about working class children and what they need and how they need to be, how their educational standards needs to be lifted up and how they've been sort of neglected for decades, let's be honest, nothing in the stuff that Robert just said, in the tools that are in the solutions that are in this report, none of them are specific to white people. I'm not really sure why label this as, the report into fixing.
They will benefit both. They will benefit all disadvantaged communities, but they will also address the problems that disadvantaged white communities face. And also we're focusing a lot on towns, because if you look at the maps in the report, that is where predominantly white working class communities live. And previously, as I say, all the funds, all the policy reform has primarily been based looking after the big cities, and the London Challenge, which has improved London schools, has been a big example of that.
A bit more to two points about poverty, though. I mean, if you look at, for example, Chinese pupils in free school meals, their outcomes educationally are better than rich whites. So you can't say that, if your analysis was true, then surely everybody in free school meals would have the same outcome. And in fact, what this report shows is the huge differentials in outcomes for free school meal pupils depending on their ethnicity.
Yeah, I'm not at all arguing that. I think that when we're talking about the white working class kids in particular, I think there's more. I still haven't heard any explanation for how their ethnicity is part of the challenge for them. I think it's more to do with the geography. It's more to do with where they live in the country.
Well, that's exactly what we've said, though. If you read the report, that's exactly what we've said. And going back to the white privilege argument, it's other people who want to turn it into an ethnicity by accusing people of being white privileged who are not, which is why we put those few pages in the report about it, to try and actually make this argument that it is about place and it's about class and where people live, and there's regional inequalities, family disengagement from the curriculum, multi-generational disadvantage, and lack of attention paid to the fact that these students don't go to university, lack of attention paid to the cultural, often the cultural factors which in white communities they want more vocational education and apprentices to do.
Rob, can we talk a bit more about that, which was quite interesting, the cultural aspects? I mean, you'll have heard it argued that if you take two kids in free school meals, say you've got a son of, take Sajid Javid for example, the son of Indian immigrants, and they came to this country mainly so their son could avail himself of the education system. His mum took him from school to the library, she made him stay there until 6 o'clock to learn, and Sajid Javid and his brother Baz, who's now a commander in the Metropolitan Police, are great examples of the British dream. But it's said, look, that is in any way a quite well understood immigrant story. But compare that to white working class culture, where you've got parents who will have had a very different experience perhaps of the education system. It was not obvious to them that working hard at school particularly paid dividends in life, so they're not going to prioritise it as parents. And so perhaps that culture could be something, and it's very difficult to talk about because politicians like you might sound as if you're talking down. But
no, we actually got we've actually looked at this in the report, and you're exactly right. And we make the point, as funny enough, the Commission for Race Disparity also made the point that often new immigrant families coming in, that they see education as a route out of poverty. And my father was an immigrant to this country. He worked day and night. I actually got sent to a private school. My father came here with nothing, but worked day and night because his view was education was everything, and that would be mean we would have success in life. What has happened with many disadvantaged white communities is, for one reason or another, they were let down in previous generations, often by the education system, or became disengaged from it. And they passed that on from one generation to the next, that disengagement. And that's why we've talked about family hubs and parental engagement programs and looked at the remarkable work of Feltham Reach Academy and others, and see whether or not it can be replicated to re-engage those families into the education system, so we don't kind of perpetuate this for this kind of disengagement for infinity. And so this is why this report is about a lot more than just the two words of white privilege, although nevertheless it is an important subject, as I say, to be debated upon.
Maurice Mcleod, that's an interesting point, isn't it? I mean, skin colour aside, you do have an issue here of white working class parents who would have been hit by perhaps deindustrialisation in the 80s, whose grandparents might have come from a culture, as my dad was. When you basically left school at 15, that's what you did. Nobody expected it to be any different. So it's not so much skin colour, it's more culture. It's what your parents experience, it's what they expect, it's what your grandparents expected. And that is simply different for the children of white working class than it is, I don't know, perhaps for the children of immigrants like Sajid Javid's parents, who would have come here thinking to themselves, this school is going to be the ladder for my son all the way up. What white working class might not have the same perspective or historical experience.
Yeah, I'm sure that intergenerational memory and all that sort of stuff comes into it. I mean, none of this, all this stuff is nuanced. So I don't think you can just look at, just say, okay, these immigrants came in and they did well, therefore there's not a problem with the system now. It might be that you're not comparing like for like necessarily. I know a lot of my friends whose families came from Africa, who are Asian, but families came from Africa. During the sort of 80s and 70s, they didn't come in poor. They didn't come to this country in the same way that maybe my mum, when she came over from Jamaica, came over. She wasn't dirt poor, but she didn't come over with any amount of wealth. She came over to sort of start at the bottom and work. So there's a different, comparing those two outlooks and those two ways of bringing up children obviously comes into it. But you can't. I don't think you can ignore the racialized nature of existence, especially for people from minority ethnic communities in Britain. That is something that follows through. And if you're saying parents aren't instilling the value of education in their kids aren't stupid. They look and they see their big brothers and people from a few years older than them who've gone through education, who've done all the right things and still aren't getting on. So you need to take into account, what's the actual offer with education? What are you being promised?
Robert Halfon and Maurice Mcleod, thanks very much indeed. Now, the Manchester bombing inquiry reported earlier this week. Douglas Murray has written this column about it this week, and he joins me now. Douglas, you've been following this for quite some time. What jumped out at you in this report?
Well, we learned a number of things. The inquiry finds the number of occasions on which Salman Abedi, the suicide bomber in question on the night of the Ariana Grande concert in 2017, the inquiry finds a number of occasions when he could have been identified and should have been identified, could have been stopped and should have been stopped. Now, inquiries like this, seems to me, having read a lot of them in my time, always are going to find faults. It's inevitable. There will be intelligence faults, there will be security faults, human error, and more. And this is no different to that extent. There's human error of a staggering kind, the most obvious being two members of the police who went for a kebab half an hour away when they were meant to be at the venue, and then ate their dinner in a secure room and basically weren't doing their job. There are things like that. But as I say in my column this week, the really disturbing thing about this inquiry by Sir John Saunders is something that is revealed by a single witness who worked for one of the security companies at the Manchester Arena on the night.
And can you tell us a bit more? This was Kyle Lawler, who was at the time an 18-year-old security guard paid £4.26 per hour.
Yeah. There's something should be said about this, by the way, which is these security companies, as we know from previous incidents, they add a sort of veneer of security. But basically, if anything serious happens, most of the time these companies are not fit for purpose. So they add a sort of feeling of security without actually providing it. And what I'm about to say, as I say in the piece, I don't want to criticise Mr. Lawler for this. He was a young man, and I can't imagine what he has on his conscience in relation to this. But he was at least honest to the inquiry. Kyle Lawler says that, like a number of other people on the night, he noticed Salman Abedi. He couldn't have failed to notice him in a way, because Salman Abedi was hanging around for more than an hour and a quarter by the entrance exits of the building. He was inside the building. He was struggling with a 32-kilogram rucksack, which we now know contained the bomb. And Kyle Lawler was one of the people on the night who noticed him, thought there was something up. And he says specifically that what he noticed about Mr. Abedi, going backwards and forwards, struggling with this extremely heavy backpack, was, he said, he had a nervous reaction whenever anyone looked at him and seemed fidgety. Now, that's not the important thing. The important thing is what Kyle Lawler said after this. He stated to the inquiry that he was fearful of identifying Mr. Abedi. He said he was fearful of being branded a racist and feared that he would be in trouble if he got it wrong. And as I say in my piece, one shouldn't blame Kyle Lawler for this. It is perhaps inevitable that some people would. But I admire the fact he was honest about it. He was honest about the fact that actually in modern Britain, quite understandably, he made the decision that if you see something, you shouldn't say something, you should shut up. Because there's far more to risk by saying something and being accused of being a racist than there is of not saying something and the bomb going off. That's a calibration that modern Britain has indoctrinated people into for many, many years, and you can't just indoctrinate people out of it.
When I was reading the report, I was really quite struck by the kind of strength of character that Kyle Lawler must have. I mean, I'm not sure in his situation. He was somebody who I think learnt his trade via an online course. So he had been given very little training, no real experience. Yet it would have been very easy for him just to pretend that he'd seen nothing, to not have anybody publicly blame him for missing something. Because of sort of some people will say, well, if only you'd blown the whistle. Of course, he's putting himself up there for criticism. I imagine, though, he's doing this to make a rather important point, that a lot of people in his position would hesitate to blow the whistle for the reasons that he gives, that you might be branded discriminatory, and I guess the same is true for anybody who's in the security industry, because when you stop somebody who looks suspicious, I guess you do need to ask yourself, am I being biased here? To what extent is racial profiling morally acceptable when it comes to stopping people going through airports, through other shopping arenas? Right. This is a dilemma we've had ever since 9/11.
That's right. In fact, of course, as you know, we have an entire industry now in Britain, as across the rest of the Western world, which says that we've not just got biases, but they're inbuilt in us, they're implicit in us, and we have to eradicate them. We have to question our alleged biases. We've got to do double takes all the time mentally. This is a whole industry that vast swathes of government, the private sector and others have imbibed. And this isn't the reason why Salman Abedi got into it. That's just one further manifestation of the problem that Kyle Lawler has so sadly put his finger on. And as you say, Fraser, this is a young guy who underwent very little training. He said that he had no particular knowledge there was going to be an incident on the night, which is true. He couldn't have known that. He could have known, he should have been told, that the terrorism threat in the UK was severe at the time. It was only shortly after the attack in Westminster, before, of course, the attack on London Bridge. But the terrorism risk status was at severe. But again, it's people much more senior than this very junior, online-trained security officer who I think have to take some responsibility for getting Britain into the position that you can't honestly identify somebody who you think might be a suicide bomber for fear of basically detonating your own career. And I mention in my piece several examples of high-profile police officers in Greater Manchester who set the scene for that. Because, as I mentioned in the piece, 1 year almost exactly before the Manchester Arena bombing, there was a test exercise at the Manchester shopping centre in which the local security services, the local emergency services, trained for basically an eventuality uncannily like the one on the night in the Manchester Arena. It was to test the preparedness of the first responders, of the emergency services, and the whole occasion was marred by a single detail, which is that the actor playing the suicide bomber on that occasion at the Manchester shopping centre shouted Allahu Akbar, or Allah is greatest, before detonating the fake device that then led to the play act and the attempt to prepare the emergency services. The whole exercise was forgotten about and massively marred by this fact, because there was an immediate backlash against the whole scenario for the person playing the suicide bomber shouting Allahu Akbar, and therefore totally appallingly, outrageously, unforgivably linking the possibility of a suicide bombing with Islamist extremism. And all of the local community leaders went off on this. How dare you make this connection? And the local police, people like the Greater Manchester Police and Crime Commissioner, Tony Lloyd, all apologised for it. They said it's outrageous. It's marred an otherwise successful event. And I think Tony Lloyd, the Greater Manchester Police and Crime Commissioner, said that this didn't add anything to the event, the shouting of Allahu Akbar. It just has the potential, he said, to undermine the great community relations we have in Greater Manchester. So this is the position that people like Kyle Lawler found themselves on the night that there was a real-time suicide bomber really standing in front of them, under their noses, struggling with a 32-kilogram bomb. They had been told by every major policeman in the area that you should do nothing to link these things, and that is why we had effectively trained people out of identifying what was under their noses.
Right. At the time, as you say, Douglas, the threat level was number 3, but right now it's number 2, substantial. It seems that in the last 20 years there's hardly been many times where there hasn't been a kind of a threat. And yet, so you can understand why the security guard didn't quite know what they wouldn't have been really expecting one of these attacks. But you also have to wonder just how much you can really expect out of relatively junior people who are, I mean, you know, you could see probably somebody senior, perhaps a soldier or something, might be able to work that thing out. But even with the Metropolitan Police, I've had lots of problems with stop and search. They've been accused of racially profiling black Londoners. Theresa May told them to stop it. And it can be a very difficult balance to get right, because if you go too much, and of course you end up with a system where people of Asian or Middle Eastern outlook get asked for their ID, even in the House of Commons here, a lot more than white. So you can see why there is concern of taking this a bit too far in certain circumstances.
Well, what happens here is that the balance swings too far in one direction. And we have to accept the fact that in 2017, the profile of a suicide bomber at a pop concert pretty much exactly fitted the profile of Salman Abedi. A young, radicalised male of North African or Middle Eastern descent. This was pretty much the likely person. It was not a woman. It was not a white woman. It was a particular profile. And you might say, well, you know, you've got to check 20 people who don't fit the profile in order to allow yourself to check one person who does fit the profile. But as we saw on the night in Manchester, these sorts of games are ones you can treat yourself to until it gets really serious. And the Manchester Arena bombing was an unbelievable event, and it should never be forgotten. It's been, to some extent, I've always said, slightly brushed over, I have to say, when you consider the amount of attention that some outrages get. The extraordinary way in which it's sort of been, brushed over, almost from the beginning. We had the whole "don't look back in anger" sort of thing about it. This whole don't draw any lessons out from it. And by the way, there are still lessons we don't know. We just don't know answers to very major questions, even after the Saunders report. I give an example in my column this week of something we still don't know. Salman Abedi's parents came to the UK in the 1990s. The father was a member of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which subsequently joined Al-Qaeda, joined up with Al-Qaeda as an affiliate. The father of Salman Abedi was in the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, and they fell out with Colonel Gaddafi in the 1990s. Very sadly, these people fell out with each other. And so Britain gave sanctuary to the Abedi parents. And that's how young Salman Abedi was born in the UK. He was born because we gave his parents asylum. And Salman Abedi and his utterly reprehensible brother were the gifts we got in Britain for this. I still can't find, after all this time and even after this review, any explanation from any official in the UK as to why this happened. Why did we give them asylum? What did we gain from it? What exactly, other than 2 appalling sons, did they give to this country or bring to this country? Nothing. Nada. Zilch. And yet nobody in authority has ever yet given an explanation for this, let alone been held accountable for this. And this is one of the things I still find absolutely astonishing in the British discussion of this. We always get in the UK, as I've written at Spectator many times, we always get these sort of slightly fake debates. To my mind, stop and search is a relatively comfortable debate compared to some of the other debates that we ought to have. Why was it that the Abedi family were in the UK? Why was it that in the London Bridge attack, only weeks later, 2 of the 3 attackers had, as far as I can understand, no legitimate cause for being in the UK? One had lied about his nationality, was found out to have lied, and then anyway wasn't deported from the UK, and the other was somebody who claimed asylum from Pakistan a few years ago. Why was the UK giving asylum to somebody from Pakistan in the late 1990s or early 2000s? Why was it that when somebody pretends to be a Moroccan, turns out to be a Libyan, hacks at women's throats on London Bridge while shouting Allahu Akbar, that nobody's much interested in what he's doing here in the first place? And all of the crappy security supremos get onto the comfortable debates. They get onto things like, to what extent is online radicalisation an issue? Because it's so much easier to talk about these crappy third-rate issues of what you can do with Google and so on. It's so much easier than just those basic elementary questions. There has never been an asking of those elementary questions. There still hasn't been. And I think it points to the failures we still have, even after all these years in the UK, of properly discussing what is a serious security threat that's ongoing.
But one potential answer there, Doug, is that we gave him, I don't know the details, but at the time, Colonel Gaddafi wasn't exactly running a benign regime. You could certainly see why somebody might be fleeing in fear of their life from that regime.
Yeah,
and like most European countries...
You can definitely see that. You can definitely see that.
So that's what he was doing in the country. That question is relatively easy to answer. That question should be relatively easy to answer, but there will be probably thousands of other Libyan refugees who've led constructive lives to the country.
I'm not at all sure that the British taxpayers' money is well spent in giving asylum to jihadists who've fallen out with other jihadists. I mean, it's possible we could decide to be the great convening centre, some people would argue we have been in recent decades, for the sort of, intra-jihadist fallout community. But I don't think that's what the British public ever wanted. I know it's something we were never asked about. So yes, there are explanations, and I'd like to hear them, and I'd like them to be stressed by the officials. I'd like them to justify their decisions. I'd like them to explain to the British public why it seems there are so many cases of people who've gone on to commit terrorist acts who, as far as I can see, gave Britain nothing and took, in the case of Salman Abedi, 22 young lives.
Douglas Murray, thanks very much for joining us on Spectator TV. Now remember, you can get a trial subscription to The Spectator and a £20 Amazon voucher for just £12 on spectator.co.uk/TV offer. you'll be able to read Douglas's column and all the other latest from our contributors and columnists. Our leader book review this week is about a new biography of William Hogarth, perhaps one of Britain's greatest satirists who inspired generations of cartoonists coming after him, including our own Michael Heath, who's been the Spectator's cartoon editor for 3 decades. Michael, I'm delighted that you can join us now on Spectator TV. So tell us, are you one of these cartoonists who has an intellectual debt to Hogarth?
Well beyond me, total genius. Amazing observer. I'm looking around him and seeing what's going on in a terrible city and all this people dying and drinking and women being naughty. Something that you couldn't possibly do nowadays. He would be countered or clouted or whatever the word is, cancelled. He wouldn't be allowed to work. And anyway, I do work in about 10 minutes or 20 minutes. That's the way it is now. You give me the size and I fill it up. But to be allowed to even talk about Hogarth or touch his hem is almost too much for me.
Well, Michael, you've been doing fantastic stuff for The Spectator for, well, longer than I've been alive, and you just get better, I'd like to say.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Can you tell us now about what you have done your, observing not just politics, but society as well, themes, certain types of people. We have it in your Battle of Britain column. Can you tell us a bit about the trends that you see now and what you're trying to depict?
Okay. Right, when I started 1952, 55, something like that, I think I had my first drawing in The Spectator in 1957.
You had Hitler playing the guitar from memory.
Oh, no.
I'm not sure you get away with that nowadays.
I can remember the clothes I put on them. The interesting thing is that in those days, you could tell men from women, and you could tell what jobs people have. A banker would come along with a bowler hat and a cane and all the rest of it, and an umbrella, and you knew where you were. There's a butcher, and you dressed in as a butcher. Nowadays, you don't know where you are, and you can't point people out by drawing them in the way they are. So our students or whoever are all dressed exactly the same, as if they've just been woken up and put some clothes on. And nothing against them, I do love them dearly, but it's a totally different time from now. I'm in total admiration for this man. I guess, and I should imagine, he took to drink at some point, and then I think he gave it up, became very religious.
But still, we get quite a lot. Our mailbag is normally pretty full every week of aspiring cartoonists sending in their work to see if they manage to catch your eye. So what advice would you have for somebody wanting to submit a cartoon to you right now? What do you think makes a good cartoon that you'd publish in The Spectator?
I am asked quite a bit about this, and unfortunately things happen and they don't know how to do it, and they don't know how to do it at such speed, and they don't take rejection. Half of my stuff is rejected. I do roughs and they're not used, and that's it. And if they choose one, so much the better. If you use me and I turn it around very quickly, I love that. But I can't say young person, it's awful, but as someone trying to do a cartoon, they will not accept rejection, which you get all the time, and they do things and they think they're very good, and then they send them into an editor or whatever it is, and they get rejected, and they say, well, I'm not doing that again, whereas I just ploughed on, and that's the way I was. That was words I'd use for it I can't use even on your television program, but I was driven to do it because I'd been shown the New Yorker of all things about 1947, and now it's as funny as nothing, it's hopeless. But it was very funny then, and I liked and got energy from American humour in those days. Now, and that's sort of gone, that vanishes. Anyway, I sent a drawing to New Yorker magazine in 1958, I think. I thought they might buy that. And they did send a letter back, and they said, I'm afraid we'd like you to alter it a bit and change it, otherwise we'll take it. So I changed it a bit and altered it. And then you send it back, and then they say, could you do this and do that, and take the foreground out and put the background in, and change the men to women. And so you get fed up with it, you don't want to do it anymore. Either way, they paid you $500, which you could do quite a bit with that then. Recently, I was asked to, by the New Yorker, or someone at the New Yorker, who said to me, could I show my drawings to them? Could I show them roughs every Thursday or Friday from here at The Spectator, and email them to the New Yorker, and I said, so that's a good idea, it's very nice, I did that, and it came back. I mean, that's fine, they rejected me. And I did this every week for a year, and they sent back the same ones, kept on rejecting everything I ever did. So, I mean, and that's me doing it. I mean, imagine someone starting out doing it. And now they draw, I don't know how they get artists. There aren't artists in the New Yorker magazine, but they're drawings of some sort, but they're not funny. Funny's out. Not with me, but...
Yeah. Michael, how much do you think you can learn about a country's politics or society from cartoons? If you were to pick up The Spectator, not read a word, but just look at the cartoons, how much could you really glean about what was going on?
Well, I think you'd learn a lot by reading The Spectator for the last 20 years or 40 years or whatever it is, or longer than that. I love it because of that. I love it because it's interesting, witty, and does all sorts of things that magazines should do, which don't.
And that's just the cartoons, of course.
Well, yes, the cartoons as well as the writing, for God's sake. It's like a pudding, and everything's in it. The drawings are in it, and then the articles are in it, and the reviews are in it, and it's something you want to read desperately. And I run around trying to get it on Thursday mornings where I live, and it's not easy to get that way. But I mean, I'm obsessed with the damn thing.
But Michael, when you're trying to get ideas for cartoons, you must have to read a lot, observe a lot. I mean, you're not going to just sit in your bedroom and have ideas come for you. If you're going to be commenting, as you do in The Spectator and in the Mail on Sunday, about what's going on, you need a depiction, a line, a sort of insight into a political situation, current affairs. There must be quite a lot of work and research that you do before the gag comes to you.
Well, yes, you have to keep your eye on the papers. And the Daily Mail and all the rest of it. And you have to find out what's going on or what's not going on or what they're moaning and screaming about and all the rest of it. The trouble is you can do a drawing one day because things are so quick that everyone forgets about it the following day when they see it. I don't know of anyone that's coming up, or any person or young person or even old person who wants to do it or can do it at the speed and make, as you say, a political statement. We make statements about all our lives and the way life is and the way things are seemed and all the rest of it. But I think it's now everything's too neurotically quick, fast and furious, and there's not much. Just get it down on paper and see what happens, and then it's the only way to make a living. I mean, I used to go from magazine to magazine to magazine, and you go in and you show them the stuff, like touch of forelock. Governor, I've got a gag here, and they look at it and they might say, go away and don't come back, or I'd love to see you again. That's what happened here, and I was on £2, 2 shillings a week. You could buy a house for that then.
Michael Heath, it's a great pleasure to speak to you as always, and there's an even special pleasure to have you debut on Spectator TV. That's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Do pick up the magazine to read a lot more along these lines. And a special thank you to Cindy Yu, our producer.